Dr. Mohammed, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and your thinking around how we close achievement gaps in Wisconsin, how we build positive culture. Let's just begin with a really basic overview of how do you define a positive school culture?
Well, I'll even go beyond my definition and one that's universally accepted by Dr. Kent Peterson, that a healthy school culture is a place that has an egalitarian belief system, starts with our philosophies about our practice, and that is that all students can and will be successful. What's interesting about that, it doesn't even mean you know how to do it yet. It just means that you're committed to that objective. And that objective guides every policy, every practice, every procedure of the organization. With those two foundational pieces, we'll figure out what to do. But cultivating those two levels, the philosophical as well as the willingness to change and challenge our practices in alignment with that philosophy, produces a healthy environment.
Okay. One of the things that we sense a lot is that people use the term culture and climate interchangeably. What for you is the difference?
They're not synonymous. Both are important, but I like to make the case that culture is much more impactful and much more important. I like to summarize it in very simple terms. The climate is how we feel, and culture is how we practice, how we behave. Now, I'd love to have an environment where people felt good about themselves, were happy and productive. But I'd rather have, if I had that choice between the two, I'm going to choose changing our behavior more than changing our attitude, how we feel. So I'd rather have a group of semi-happy people that were productive than happy, unproductive people. And the state of Maryland, about 3 years ago, did a huge climate survey throughout the entire state and found that some of the schools in Maryland that had some of the highest climate results had some of the worst results. So culture is about interrupting norms of practice, beliefs, theories, practices, where climate is really just addressing how people feel. So I can make you happy and you can be unproductive simultaneously. Culture is about manipulating those habits, those beliefs, those attitudes, those dispositions to be aligned with the objective of learning for all.
So in theoretically, it would be possible to have a positive climate, but a toxic culture.
Absolutely.
What would that look like?
A group of people who are happy with status quo, and they're focused on their relationships as adults. Do I like the principal? Does the principal like me? Do I like my teammates? Do my teammates like me? But we could be very unproductive, but we like each other. It's comfortable. People stick around for years. We have staff outings, and there's nothing wrong with that. As long as it doesn't interfere with your ability to challenge your practice and your work as it pertains to affecting children. That's change of culture.
Okay, thank you.
So he said that the biggest impact is school culture, and that's what we want to see. So what relationship or what correlation do you have between school culture and student achievement?
Oh, it's highly correlated. In John Hattie's large visible learning meta-analysis and his isolation of 252 variables and studying their impact on student learning using the Cones-D standard deviation model, he measured each one of their impacts against student learning. And the top three are all cultural. The teacher's perception of the probability of student success, collective teacher efficacy, and student self-efficacy are the three most impactful factors in student learning. So it'd be foolish to focus on the pedagogical strategies that he identified as highly impactful and ignore the frames of mind and the culture necessary for those practices to be highly impactful. He said collective teacher efficacy is the foundation of it all. So a highly impactful strategy like formative assessment at an effect size of 0.9, it's about 2 years worth of student growth. He said that 0.9 is conditional, that is actually being applied in an environment of collective teacher efficacy. So in an environment where there's low teacher efficacy, you can use common formative assessment and it won't have nearly impact. It doesn't, all those strategies happen within a context. So the context in which you use strategy is actually more important than the strategy itself.
Wow. Yeah.
So in your book, Transforming School Culture, you talk about the believers and the tweeners and the survivors and the fundamentalists. And when we're working with our cohorts around the state, there's always a lot of resonance around the concept of the fundamentalists. Could you please tell us about fundamentalism among school staff and how it impacts schools and their culture, as well as how leaders should address the fundamentalists in their schools?
Well, the term fundamentalist actually came out of religious context, and often in a modern political context, people try to refer to it as an Islamic concept, but it actually came out of the Lutheran Church. As Martin Luther broke away from the Catholic Church and started the first Protestant movement, after he passed, the Lutheran Church had a difficult time with recruitment. And as the archbishops were gathered about how do we reignite the movement, there were a lot of people who were pointing to the fact, a lot of leaders in the church were the fact that there were antiquated strategies, antiquated protocol and traditions that didn't attract new converts. So they were making recommendations about changing some of the traditions of the church. Well, there's a group that got up and left in protest because they felt any challenge of the fundamental premise of Lutheranism was counterproductive, whether it was responsible for the lack of growth of the faith or not. And they became known as a fundamentalist. And in sociological terms, it means a person or group of people who believe there's only one pure way to behave or to practice. And they refuse to change even in the face of compelling evidence. So if a school's purpose is learning for all, and I have this theory that there's only one pure way to deliver service because it worked for me, I'm comfortable with it, my belief system is that auditory instruction, where students listen, process, regurgitate, one shot in a summative way, is the best and the only way to purely deliver services, regardless of the outcome, then I become a fundamentalist. Because my personal value system and my theory of practice conflicts with the stated objectives of the organization, which is learning for kids. So I don't even consider changes in practice because it doesn't jive, it causes cognitive dissonance with what I believe is a pure way to deliver it. So that cognitive dissonance typically encourages gossip, slander, backbiting, politics that nurture conflict between parts of the organization. And what happens with fundamentalists, they disrupt the stability of the organization, so we can't even have good, rational dialogue about changes to our practice. So I would say from an internal professional standpoint, the behaviors of fundamentalists are the biggest threat to us embracing the best practices that would work for our kids, because it's about them. It's not about the student.
So what do we do about that?
Yeah.
Well, one thing that we found in my Transforming School Culture study is that when leaders model the behavior for believers, they gave believers permission to have influence in the informal culture. Fundamentalists tend to operate very well informally and emotionally. So their political platform is to search for dissatisfaction and then nurture that dissatisfaction. And they nurture it emotionally and they nurture it privately. So fundamentalists do not thrive in environments where there is a logical dialogue and it's open and it's public. So a leader who has the courage to confront that openly and logically has now provided those believers who have access to the informal part of the culture, has modeled the behavior that undermines fundamentalist influence. So there's a public addressing of the issue, and there's a private. No one leader can do it by his or herself, because silence, when I work with schools and I stimulate kind of an open dialogue about controversial issues, in an environment where fundamentalists are really savvy, they don't really engage. You have to make them engage. And their engagement happens at the break or in the parking lot. That's where believers' duty of peer pressure is essential. You have to stand up on what you believe is best for children. Now, as a leader, I can model that for you. I give you permission. But it has to be a coordination between the formal and the informal. So in Chapter 6 and 7 of Transforming School Culture, Chapter 6 I get into the nature of fundamentalists and their impact. And Chapter 7 is about how do we address it and how do we overcome it.
Could you talk with us a little bit about the accountability piece around fundamentalism? As a former principal, I ran into some brick walls around accountability for fundamentalism, but it clearly is a big piece of the picture.
Yeah. Well, accountability is one of 4 important strategies for either influencing fundamentalists positively or showing them the door. It has to be one of the two. Either you're going to change or you're going to have to leave. And if you stay, you're going to have to change whether you want to or not. That's the condition of staying. So we're looking at a leadership approach that's a balance between support and accountability. Support has to come before accountability. Many people who spiral into fundamentalism really are victims of their environment and how they've been socialized professionally and personally. So there are 3 high leverage supports that make accountability effective. If accountability is used out of season, it actually can be counterproductive. So 3 key tools for building consensus with people who are apprehensive and actively resistant. Number 1 is communication. People become reluctant to engage in the change process if historically authority has been used as the tool and we flip-flop from one thing to the next. If I can appeal to your sense of logic, there are some people who are willing to let go if they understand it is better. The second is emotional, it's building relationships. So what I say may make sense, but I'm your 5th principal in 5 years. Your issue isn't that you don't think that what I'm saying or where I'm taking to school is not logical. You don't trust me or the organization. So I have to build a bridge of trust. The third is incapacity. I call it answering the question, how? I know why it's necessary. I trust you. I just don't know how to unwrap a standard. I don't know how to create a proficiency scale. I don't know how to do a Tier 1 intervention. That's a very legitimate need. And that's an investment in training, resources, mentoring, protocol. My Transforming School Culture work showed that about 98% of the factors that lead to resistance to change can be addressed with those 3 specific leadership behaviors. And for that 2% who that doesn't work for, the only strategy left is authority. If you know why, you know how. We've addressed all of the issues of trust. I'm not asking you at this point, I'm telling you. But if that strategy comes before the support, it's out of season and politically counterproductive, because now you just made that person a martyr. You have to isolate him or her to a point where everybody recognizes that their behavior is illogical.
Thank you.
So here in Wisconsin, we have engaged in school improvement efforts for decades. And
Like
right
everybody
now
else.
Yep, but we also have the largest achievement gap in the nation right now. And we're just wondering a little bit around, we've made so little progress in closing that gap. What might be some reasons for that? And not just in Wisconsin, but nationally.
It's a national problem. And our achievement gap is one, we just have a social gap. Economic gap, housing gap, healthcare gap. So the achievement gap is just one appendage or one spoke on the wheel. So there's an external set of contributors, but there's also internal. My argument is that inequity is palatable. That as long as there's not dissatisfaction, then there won't be change. One of my favorite authors is Eric Hoffer, and he's a social scientist. He's passed away. But he studied mass social movements in a book that really sums it. It's called The True Believer. And he gets into the nature of mass movements, like women's suffrage, like civil rights movement, like the French Revolution. These people didn't have like a dog whistle. What made all these people come together for this mass movement? And he said the key ingredient is mass dissatisfaction. That discontent is different than dissatisfaction. Discontent means it's annoying, I recognize it's not fair, but I can live with it. People can live with the achievement gap. Only when it becomes dissatisfaction do we see motion? Let me give you an example. When Common Core was rolled out, Common Core was developed for a good reason. The standards are very rigorous. The state's desire to collaborate was very good. You create consortia of states, and Arizona can share with California, and California, we can look at, it's like PLC, we're looking at common formative assessment. Why are kids knocking it out of the park in Montana, but struggling in Indiana? And we can share, here's our invest. It's PLC at a mass stage. As the New York experiment was rolled out, and Park was piloted in New York, and they found on average that student performance was 50% lower in proficiency than on the traditional New York State test. Now superintendents had to go back to their constituencies and say, I can't explain to you all the nuances of Common Core, but these kids you thought that were super brilliant, turns out they're not quite as brilliant as you thought. We were 95% proficient on the old state multiple choice tests, but when we have rigorous standards where kids have to demonstrate at multiple levels, we're at about 40%. So that price you paid for your home, which was 5 times what it would have been in any other environment, can't justify that anymore. And communities all around the country where they were used to privilege stood up and they were lobbying. People started dropping Common Core like a hot potato. They were abandoning it, abandoning the assessments and the consortium that they were in, either Park or Smarter Balance, and now it's just a small handful of states who use it as it was designed. Why did that change happen? Because it was a constituency that as a society we were empathetic for. As long as kids in Milwaukee, in Detroit, in Chicago are looked at as disposable, we'll never develop the social will to make the changes necessary to build equity. Inequity is convenient until it affects me. That's why we still have an achievement gap.
So when you think about that, so I think you've addressed some of this question around mindsets, but how do we start to impact some of those mindsets? Because I think about the language we use around creating a sense of urgency, but it's the dissatisfaction that we need to get at and impacting mindsets. So what are some thoughts you have around?
Well, starts with looking at data and concrete evidence and calling people on their moral hypocrisy. You go to any school in the state of Wisconsin or anywhere in the country, you read their mission statements, it almost makes you want to burst into a chorus of We Are the World. We want every child to be lifelong. They go through the whole spiel. Then later evidence around equity next to that and make them deal with it. Then I would recommend providing some exemplars, examples, practices that other schools have used to strategically address some of the issues of equity that each school has. What have schools done about a vocabulary gap? What have they done about disproportionate suspensions? What have they done about disproportionate identification for special ed? Because identifying the problem is just the first stage. Okay, now you got my interest. Now what do I do about it? Because if the theory is the problem is the student and it's an insurmountable obstacle, you just identified a problem and quantified it when they probably picked it up intrinsically anyway. Quantifying it just creates a sense of urgency. Now with that sense of urgency, you have to follow it up with skills and tools and strategies and structures that effectively address that. And then you have to build a culture where we hold people accountable for using those. If we do that, each individual school has hope. Because we're seeing some schools nationwide who've moved the needle on equity. We just haven't seen it in mass, at scale. So we know how to do it. My kind of input is we probably won't see it in mass until there's a universal cry for equity. But that doesn't mean that Johnson Elementary School can't start working on equity tomorrow.
We've experienced some pushback when we've even gently started to push against mindsets that might continue inequitable outcomes. If we were to think big, because this is really a huge endeavor, but start small, because I think it is going to happen step by step, one school at a time. What are some steps that we could take immediately to start down the road to equitable outcomes for all students? And what advice would you give to school leaders in Wisconsin as they face the challenge of closing the gaps?
Well, anytime you're looking at large-scale change, you got to start small and to do some pilots. Start with some low-hanging fruit. Schools or districts where the staff and leadership actually want equitable outcomes, because that's where you're going to really prove to those who are resistant or apprehensive that this can actually work. A good model is what's happening in Arkansas. Arkansas chose the PLC at Work model as their ESSA school improvement protocol. And they're taking a non-punitive approach. Schools that have been identified as failing, they built PLC centers across the state, trained a cohort of consultants, coaches, created a protocol of training, and they have these model schools that they're working with. And they hired a company out of Oregon, a think tank, to do objective empirical research and analyze the impact of this practice. And they're going to put out a report about the impact. They're using that model as a way of proving that a certain set of practices work. Then their plan is to scale it up for the state and say, now that we have evidence that this works, now we're expecting each one of you to do it. I think that that model is very workable. I think it's reasonable. Looking at something the scale of the entire state, so start with some low-hanging fruit. Make some investments in some areas you think you can make some real progress, and use those schools and those environments as models for duplicating and scaling it up at a larger level. That would be my advice.
Okay, thank you. How long do you think it's going to take us?
It's sad that I don't know, and this is why. Because whenever we think we're making progress, they just move the goalposts. If you read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow,
Oh, yeah.
discrimination just morphs and changes forms. And until we lose the desire to change forms, then I don't know. I think one thing that has to be addressed, though, is that every marginalized community has to accept its own responsibility for self-efficacy. It becomes convenient to always look at others as perpetrators and not take self-responsibility. In my book, Overcoming the Achievement Gap Trap, I did kind of an historical analysis of recent world movements. They're all organically and intrinsically developed. I can't find one movement that was the result of external philanthropy or external stimulation. From India and Nehru and their math and science revolution, to the growth of China as a world leader, Japan after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the investment they made in transforming their society. So though I can look at government, I can look at racism, classism, sexism, people who are marginalized have a responsibility for their own agency. Frederick Douglass said that power concedes nothing without a demand. So I'm equally as honest with communities who allow themselves to be victims and don't embrace their own power of change. Things will become equitable when you demand it.
I really appreciated that in that book, actually, that mindset presentation. I appreciated that.
Because I have to give you permission to marginalize me. If I don't give you permission, then you can't do it. You can try, but you can't make me feel a certain way. That's the benefit of my mother and grandmother's tutelage. That I've never walked into a situation feeling inferior. Like you owe me something.
So one last big, to quote Rick DeFore, big, hairy, audacious piece of advice. What would you tell us?
It's really pretty simple. Student by student, standard by standard. There are white middle-class kids struggling in Wisconsin.
Yes,
There are rich kids struggling in Wisconsin. There are kids who come from two-parent homes struggling in Wisconsin. If our mindset is student by student, standard by standard, whatever it takes, we won't even have to have an equity conversation.
And it's the responsibility of the adults in the school
To get them.
to make sure it happens.
And to use our resources in ways that make sense to make investments in where our students' needs are. It'll look different in Brown Deer than it will look in Toma or in Madison, but the outcome should be similar.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure
Thank you.
talking with you today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Good luck, Wisconsin.